to introduce the topic.
Ian, thank you very much. And good to see so many who signed up for the evening. We hope we have good conversations between now and 9 o'clock. In the late 1960s, from a psychological perspective, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross outlined 5 elements to the death-grief process. And her typology of grief was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Now, we might recognize these from our own personal experience of grief and loss, recognize them from pastoral work or counseling, or as we have observed grief in others. The typology is not just personal, but can also be collective. A group, a community, or a nation may move through this process of grieving and loss. So we might find the typology useful. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Collectively, what have we lost? What do we need to grieve? There are political, cultural, and religious losses. So first, there is a need to grieve political losses. The 7 or 8 European empires have all faced this, or they're still in the process. The Dutch have fairly recently decided to return all their imperial loot, which might indicate that they have arrived at some acceptance of loss and power. Others are not there yet. Spain has been very angry recently with the Mexican president's reminder of what Spain did through imperial genocide to his people. The former empires spend a long time in denial and expect those who suffered under them to also be in denial. Well, these are big geopolitical issues, but we need to grieve political losses much closer to home. What do unionists need to grieve? What have unionists lost? Now, let me say that I'm not raising these questions from any party political perspective or to make that kind of political point. I am not, let me say, a nationalist, and I am not a unionist. And ever since I became politically aware in my teens, I've never identified with either nationalism or unionism. Decades before we used the phrase neithers, I suppose I've always been a neither, though if I'm to be categorized, I'd prefer an historical older phrase of dissenter. So when I ask what unionists need to grieve and what unionists have lost, I'm coming from the perspective expressed by the title of a book by C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed. Have unionists ever really grieved the 1972 loss of Stormont, when the British government decided to end 51 years of unionist one-party rule and domination and the monopoly of power? The Ulster workers' strike that followed 2 years later brought to an end a power-sharing form of governance, may have been grief expressed in anger. But what did it achieve? 51 years later, things have changed again. 24 years on from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, there are unionists who have accepted the need for power sharing in a deeply contested society, but still too many, and political representatives who do not accept power sharing. The loss of an absolutely unionist Stormont has perhaps not been grieved or accepted. There is no grieving either that Northern Ireland is no longer a unionist state. The 2021 census returns will likely show that unionists or Protestants are no longer a majority in Northern Ireland, nor that there is any real majority. The demographics have been changing for some time. And though the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is clear, even if the language is ambiguous, if not misleading, unionists may likely not have the post of First Minister after the May elections. First and Deputy First Ministers are equal, but unionists have told themselves for too long that first is literally first, and neither is this fear and panic that Sinn Féin will likely have the First Minister post in a new assembly. And the less than creative response to that is to suggest that Unionists refuse to nominate a Deputy First Minister and collapse the assembly before it even begins a new mandate. Grieving political loss may need to acknowledge as part of the acceptance that back in the 17th century, the Articles of Plantation of James I were a deliberate and intentional strategy to change the demographics of the province of Ulster, to make it a Protestant province. Just over 300 years later, when the 1920 Government of Ireland Act partitioned Ireland, the border was drawn on a purely sectarian head count. The border was where it was, around 6 counties, because there was a 2/3 Protestant majority, and therefore it was felt a secure Protestant state. We are not in 1922, when the Anglo-Irish Treaty confirmed the border and the Protestant state. And after the collapse of the Boundary Commission in 1925, leaving the border unchanged, the Protestant churches in the new Northern Ireland called for and held special services of thanksgiving that the border was unchanged. They thanked God that the sectarian head count was untouched. We will return later to whoever our ancestors at that stage thought this God was. Today, we still struggle to make Northern Ireland a shared space, and Unionists need to grieve and accept loss, and only by naming loss and acknowledging it, coming to acceptance of it, can a self-confident, healthy identity be realised. Now, Unionists don't need to stop being Unionists, and they can articulate their aspiration to remain in the Union. But Unionists can't perhaps do that, and they haven't done it convincingly, because perhaps they have not grieved political loss and lack the self-confidence and strong, healthy identity to articulate the future vision. What this does not need is a nationalist or Republican community or elements of it telling a grieving people to pull themselves together, get over it, and accept reality, as if those elements know what reality is. Not all, but some, too many, read the reality as simplistic and romantic. Unionist loss and grief requires a nationalist and Republican community to be generous, sensitive to grief and the grieving process, to empathise with the grief struggle. And only people who have been there can do that. And so there is no place for any sense of political victory or triumphalism. People in grief need others to accompany them. People who can be trusted to share the articulation of loss and pain. No person or collective gets through the grief process to a place of acceptance without being accompanied. Second, the need to grieve the loss of imagined identity. Identity is the sense of who we are and where we belong, are being challenged for all of us. We live in a world without certainties now. And in all these 3 areas of grief and loss, political, cultural, and religious losses, we are in fact grieving the loss of certitude. In terms of faith and faith identities, faith never had anything to do with certitude. Faith has always been the radical opposite of certitude. And apart from religious identities, the other primary cultural identity has been nationalism of various shades. Indeed, for many, national identity has primacy over religious identity, or they have been conflated. And what we mean by God has a national identity. The Anglo-Irish political scientist and historian Benedict Anderson, in his best-known book, Imagined Communities, described nationalism as an imagined political community that is imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. Now, he did not mean by imagined that it was fake, But nationalism and nations are constructs of our imagination. He pointed out that although many of us think that nations are very old or timeless, that they have always existed, they are in fact very recent and modern creation in the last 200 or 300 years. When we imagine nations and nationalism, we imagined the divine right to rule and gave that divine right to rulers. In our modern European history, that was given to or claimed by monarchs and was looked upon as a natural way, or as the Church was happy to say, the divinely given way of organizing society. James I of the plantation of Ulster was big into the divine right of kings, especially the divine right given by a Protestant God. The Catholic monarchs of France got away with divine right until the French Revolution. Then the monarchical God was abolished. And nationalism was so influential that not only did it determine our identity, thousands, millions were prepared to die for their nation, make the supreme blood sacrifice for which the Church provided a ready-made theology. Perhaps we need to realize that our identity, like nationalism, is also imagined. We construct our identity. But because we live in history and in time, nothing lasts or is guaranteed to last, and so identity or identities keep changing. There are no certainties or guarantees. When the identity markers are no longer there, many have a tendency to resist. Imagined identity has become frozen and cannot and must not change. Therefore, the imagined nation or society must not or ever be allowed to change. And rather than grieve the loss of imagined identity in Kubler-Ross's typology, we become angry, even violent, and will defend our imagined identity and society by violence, and in the process become immersed in depression, an overwhelming sense of worthlessness, leading to acts of community self-harming and self-destruction. Fluid identity may realize imagined identity, recognize in the words of two poets that time makes ancient good uncouth, and our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. Few, perhaps, can live with that, without certainties, knowing that nothing lasts, but all changes. But somehow those who do can realize that not only do we imagine our identities, but when they fade and collapse, we can reimagine identity. In Northern Ireland and in perhaps much of the rest of the country, identity at times seems to be so wrapped up in or is imagined as military identity, certainly a military mystique. Militarized mindsets are pervasive. National memorials are imitated by Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries. Military structures and titles are mimicked. The myth of redemptive violence is at the heart of so much policy, including the paramilitary policies. The heroes are those who made the supreme sacrifice, the blood sacrifice that is the price of freedom. And the Church again provides the theology and the guarantee of eternal life. Fintan O'Toole, in his recent award-winning book, reminds us of the sheer extent to which the 1981 Republican hunger strikes were saturated with religious Christian imagery, allusions, biblical texts, and theological references. We might rush in a more secular Ireland to say, this was the instrumentalization of religion for political purposes and condemn it. But was it? Recently, some loyalists placed a stone in the grounds of Stormont to celebrate the centenary of Northern Ireland. It has a quotation from James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, pledging, paraphrasing, that he would die for Ulster rather than lose it. Well, not only did Craig not die for Ulster or go anywhere near dying for Ulster, He insisted, and he got, the partition of the province of Ulster and abandoned the Unionists of the three Ulster counties of Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal to fend for themselves. To use a widely quoted image from that time, there were not enough lifebelts. The implication being that the now border Unionists could drown. Imagined identity can be built on imagined history, fictionalized history. We will come back to the prominent words in that stone for God and Ulster when we look at grieving religious loss. But we're now aware that growing numbers of people in Northern Ireland no longer wish to be identified with either of our binary identities. Binaries are being rejected, whether Protestant or Catholic, Unionist or Nationalist. And we have growing emerging communities and will become increasingly multi-ethnic, multicultural and multi-religious. Identities are not fixed or static. They are changing and they will keep changing. Anger at that will and is being expressed through increasing racism and hate crimes, which are now overtaking sectarian crimes in Northern Ireland. France is an interesting example of a place that has been living through shifting patterns of identity. Simplistic identities have given way to an interplay of opposites, or as the French have come to see it, the multiple patterns within a single kaleidoscope. And the appeal of the kaleidoscope as a metaphor was that its patterns could be shaken. The kaleidoscope metaphor in which identities are shaken might be a helpful metaphor on the island of Ireland. It may well be, though, that more shaking needs to be done. A poll towards the end of last year suggested that the majority of people in the South would like to see a united Ireland. But some 60 to 70% didn't think that the flag or the anthem should change. At the same time, a serious suggestion that the Northern Ireland soccer internationals should drop the British anthem, God Save the Queen, and have something with which all the team could identify, got a rather cold response. Flags and anthems shall not change. The poll question in the South was in the context of United Ireland or the reunification of Ireland. But the reunification of Ireland and a new Ireland are not the same. Maybe North and South, it is still, though, a case of what we have, we hold. And if Unionists need accompanied in their grieving political and cultural losses, and few Republicans can walk with them, maybe it's because Republicans have not yet grieved their political and cultural losses in a world that has left their narrative of 1916 away in the past. Maybe in 2022, we all need each other to grieve and reach a place of acceptance. Howard Zinn, one of America's greatest historians, said something about history equally applicable to the politics of identity. Quote, "The idea that people make history and can alter its course, that institutions have human origins and can be changed by humans, is truly subversive." Finally, the need to grieve religious loss. The Archbishop of Canterbury, I suspect anticipating the findings of the 2021 census, acknowledges that in England, Christians are now a minority. Churches in England, and not just the Anglicans, may need to grieve their empty buildings and the loss of power and role and status. For Anglicans as the state church, the head of which is the monarch, and with numbers of its bishops sitting in the House of Lords, there is difficulty and there are questions about its future establishment. And there may be difficult questions for the monarchy as well. This is not just England, where Christians are now in a minority. It is true for all of the UK, which has perceived itself in the past as a Christian nation. Can we speak any longer of a Christian nation? Is Ireland a Christian nation? Or Europe a Christian continent? What was a Christian nation or continent? For at least 500 years were the 7 European empires Christian empires? Well, they believed that they were. The Prussian-German Empire proclaimed "for God and fatherland," while the British imperial motto was "for God and empire." And people are still awarded the British Empire Medal or an OBE with those words inscribed on them. Well, there are no European empires now. Maybe there is no God either. European church attendance, if that is a measure of active Christian commitment, is probably under 10%. It is also that in some areas of Dublin. Those churches which keep records in Northern Ireland, the Catholic Church and the Church of Ireland, acknowledged some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, that attendance was 20% and 15% respectively. It may even be lower now. And across the churches, it might range from a generous 18% to 12%. The reality is that church attendance as a marker for Christian practice may well have dropped some 70 or 80% in the north in a century. The south also has seen huge decline. Now, this is not to make a causal connection, but simply to observe bookmarks or bookends. But since the partition of Ireland, the practice of religion has seriously declined, as has the role and status of churches. Sometimes church leaders lament the rise of the secular in Ireland and what they see as the marginalisation of the churches. But secular is the separation of church and state. And that is a reality now in both parts of Ireland. Once large and powerful churches no longer sit close to political power and influence and even dominance. The churches don't have the status, entitlement, or clout anymore. There is a real separation of church and state and of religion and politics. I suppose we've caught up with the rest of Europe, with the journey to the secular that seriously began after World War I. And from the moral and spiritual crisis that catastrophic war brought about. It accelerated after World War II, and by the late 1960s, the tide of church, cultural disestablishment and demise had begun to reach Ireland. Noted historian of Christianity, Dermot McCulloch, is right, I think, to suggest that World War I destroyed Christendom. That is when Christendom, that alliance of church and state since the 4th century, died. World War I was the end of European imperial powers. 6 had gone to war in 1914, and by 1918, 4 of those empires had died and become historical wreckage. The remaining 2 lasted for only another 3 decades. Imperial Christianity also died after 1918. Christendom died. Irish Christendom took a bit longer to expire, but we have now lived through it. Where are we in the typology of grieving? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance? It's not only the death of Christendom that we may need to grieve, it's the death of the Christendom God. Anglican evangelicals in 19th century England believed in providentialism, as did many across Europe at that time. God controlled all of life and all of history, and God, when necessary, was the great interventionist. That is the theology of Anglican evangelicals in the British government that was brought to the Irish famine. The economic system was determined and fixed by God and couldn't be changed. Politicians could not interfere with or step into the terrible hunger and famine destroying thousands and thousands of lives in Ireland. Theologically, the famine was the sovereign providentialist God's way of reducing an overpopulated Ireland, even to punish a morally sick people. This, of course, was the God of the empires, the God of the powerful and the civilized, the morally superior. And this was the Christendom God behind the Latin letters DG on British coins by divine appointment. And then in Ireland, we came up with For God in Ireland and For God in Ulster. Same old imperial theology. A providential interventionist God who would come and deliver us, as covenant and proclamation said, deliver us as God had our fathers of old. Christendom had died, and so too did the God of Christendom. We now have an environmental crisis and a potential catastrophe, and there is no God to come and fix it. America may want to make America great again, but there is no God to trust to do it. British conservatives may want to put the great back into Britain, but there is no DG by divine appointment. Wall murals in the last year celebrating Northern Ireland's centenary proclaimed, "In God we trust," looking in part, no doubt, to the future. But even though the Protestant churches in 1925 held a special day of thanksgiving, giving thanks to God that the Boundary Commission had collapsed and the sectarian border remained, that there is no God to guarantee or ensure that a border will remain and Northern Ireland will see 2121, or that there will still be a United Kingdom or a USA. That's the problem with the stone that some loyalists set up at Stormont. For God and Ulster, it says. Not only is there no Ulster, there is no God. Christendom has died, and so too has the Christendom God. There is a deeper issue. At the heart of biblical Israel's vision and understanding was that every notion of God carries with it a proposal for the organization of society. Every notion of God carries with it a proposal for the organization of society. That is core Hebrew Bible theology. And whether for God and empire, or fatherland, or for God and Ulster, what kind of society is being envisioned? What social practice and organization is being proposed by the notion of God? Well, we may have reached the end of religious nationalism. We can no longer wrap God up in a tricolour, or a Union flag, or the Stars and Stripes. The Christendom God is dead, if such a God ever existed. Are we all atheists now? We may need to grieve religious loss, and we do need in the process to ask ourselves, just what do we mean when we invoke the word G-O-D? Grieve the loss of the Christendom God, but how do we vision, imagine, think, or speak of that symbol, G-O-D? How or who or what do we worship? What are we doing in worship when we gather? Can we speak or sing of G-O-D after Christendom? Let me end with two contemporary pointers and hope Secular Europe has wonderful cathedrals still standing. They are not museums, and they're far from belonging to the age of dinosaurs. Thousands visit them each year, and thousands still worship in them. And they have reinvented themselves as centres for music and arts and drama and social engagement. Some have even been used recently as vaccination centres. Read Simon Jenkins' wonderful book on Europe's 100 best cathedrals. The French Enlightenment philosophers called them embarrassments to reason. The Emperor Napoleon walked into the great cathedral at Chartres and said, "This is no place for an atheist." They are not monuments to anti-reason. Science and intellect went into their creation. They inspire awe. They represent more than reason, the something more. And the great cathedrals are the great expressions and experiences of mystery. They are icons of mystery and awe and otherness. God? Incomprehensible mystery? We don't know, we can't know. Words, concepts, definitions, doctrines, theologies are inadequate. Mystery. Maybe a lot of our post-Christendom worship has been dumbed down and devoid of mystery and transcendence and awe. Worship in the 21st century, post-Christendom worship, needs imagination to create symbols and rituals and language and metaphors to not know and know that we don't know and encounter and experience mystery. That, I think, is why thousands of secular people flock to the great cathedrals. The other pointer is a great human being to whom the world said goodbye just after Christmas. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the embodiment of something perhaps we do know of God, justice. Social justice for every human being, irrespective of colour, class, creed, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and justice for all of nature and creation. Tutu embodied social justice, equality, compassion, and non-violence, because that was his experience of that ultimate symbol we rightly and hesitantly name as God. And Tutu's ashes have been interred behind the pulpit of Cape Town's cathedral. Mystery and justice were Tutu's notion of God that carried with it a proposal for the organization of society. The worship life and practice of a community of faith in a post-Christendom world will embody, experience, and practice the incomprehensible mystery and justice of God. Only as we grieve our losses, political, cultural, and religious, will we reach the point of acceptance, out of which those ancient Hebrew exiles in Babylon processed their grief and came to a new imaginative vision of God and of identity and purpose in a new future. And we move, I think, at this